Hello, my friends. My name is Darren Gerdes. I'm just a professor trying to give you context in the war in Ukraine. Every Monday, what I do is I go over the week's events, the previous week from Monday to Sunday, and I highlight the big story each day and maybe a story that was not maybe big news, but it should have been big news. So let's go back to Monday, the 19th of February. And so the first, and there are actually a few big stories that day, Zelenskyy visited the AFU's forward positions in Kupiansk, and that would have been the big story that day, except it was overshadowed by a Russian pilot who hijacked an Mi-8 for Ukraine. A helicopter was found dead in Spain, and that was very suspicious. He was riddled with bullets, and it doesn't look like it was gang violence or something. It looks like it was a hit job. Now, that would have been the big story, except that was overshadowed by the Air Force of Ukraine shot down 2 Russian fighter jets that day, and so that was the big story that day. Now, the story that you might have missed was that the Kremlin has never been richer thanks to a U.S. strategic partner. Who is it and what? Well, India has been absorbing all the oil that it could possibly lap in from Russia, and then it's essentially repurposing it and selling it abroad, and so they're just becoming the middleman. Some of the stans, like Kazakhstan and Tajikistan and other stans, are also doing the same thing with imports, violating sanctions. So I keep saying sanctions don't work in and of themselves. They don't work, and they need to be more clearly enforced. And unless India stops taking in the oil and selling it abroad after they take it in, and unless you're willing to put sanctions on India, then it's going to keep happening. Okay, Tuesday, 20 February. So the big story that day was that hundreds of Ukrainian troops were feared captured or missing in a chaotic retreat from Avdiivka. And it was a pretty bad scene with the retreat from Avdiivka. The Russians paid a very dear price for taking Avdiivka, and the story that you may have missed that day was this: more Russian soldiers die seizing Avdiivka than in Soviet-Afghan war, according to experts, and that was in the Independent in the UK. Now, I'm not sure about the math about that. Maybe it's slightly off, but the spirit of that article is right. So that's 5 months in Avdiivka as opposed to almost a decade in Afghanistan, and that's pretty powerful and telling. Okay, Wednesday, 21 February, 2024. So the big stories that day, and there are 2 of them, was that, and the story that would have been the big story was that the EU approves new sanctions against Russia over Ukraine war that would include over 200 people and entities. That would be totaling now 2,000 sanctions. The question that you have to ask when you hear about another round of sanctions, why not just have done all these sanctions right up front? Why are we adding another one like this one's going to do it? Again, sanctions in and of themselves don't work. But that was overshadowed by Ukraine took out another Russian fighter jet that brought its kill streak up to 7 within a week. And so that's pretty significant. I'm not sure if it was a Su-34 or 35 that day, but it was pretty significant. Now, that would be the big story for the day. The story that you might have overlooked was that a pro-war Russian blogger who revealed a huge Avdiivka loss dies by suicide. Now, it could have legitimately been suicide. I mean, they were really shaming this guy, or it could have been something more malicious, and who knows what really happened there, but that was a story that you might have missed. Okay, next day, Thursday, 22 February, 2024. The big story was a seismic shift for the way that the West has dealt with weapons that are given to Ukraine. Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO head, said that Ukraine has the right to carry out strikes with F-16s on Russian military targets outside of Ukraine, and that's really big, because before this, nope, you can use it within the boundaries of your country. That includes Crimea, but they've never allowed that before. The story that you might have missed, unless you listened to my 3 big stories where I did talk about this, was Russia's ultimate goal is to take Kyiv and Odessa, according to Dmitry Medvedev. Now, they're saying this blatantly, and so that when we're talking about, well, let's just sit down and have peace with them, they're not going to have peace. They actually want to keep going. So that was the story that you might have missed that day. Friday, 23 February 2024. The big story that day was that now the U.S. is to impose sanctions on 500 Russia-linked targets to mark the anniversary of the war. By the way, Friday, 23 February was marking 2 full years of war. Like completing 2 full years of the war, and they're going to do this thing. Well, that was then overshadowed by another big story, which was pretty significant, and perhaps more significant because, again, sanctions don't work like we think they do. Ukraine says it downed a second Russian A-50 spy plane. That's the equivalent of our AWAC, and Russia only has so many of these, and they're very hard to build, and this is the plane that kind of controls combat in the air, so that was a really big event on that day. The story that you might have missed is that Senator Chuck Schumer made a surprise visit to Ukraine to reaffirm support. Now, that was good. That was important. It would have been better if McConnell and Johnson were there in order to reaffirm support, but, dare to dream. Okay, Saturday, 24 February 2024. So the big story that day was that Western leaders were in Kyiv to pledge support for Ukraine on the war's anniversary. And so what actually happened there was that, the leaders of, I'm trying to remember which countries, but France and the EU, the head of the EU, and I think Italy, and I'm trying to remember Denmark or something. I don't remember exactly which it was, but a number of European leaders were there being shown with Zelenskyy, showing solidarity. Story that you might have missed was that ex-President Medvedev said that Moscow will seek revenge for Western sanctions. Well, of course, he's going to say all kinds of nutty things, including that. And there's another story that you might have missed. A day or two before, apparently Navalny's mother was told that she can't have his body back and unless she agrees to a very private ceremony in an undisclosed location or something along those lines. Otherwise, it would be buried in the prison. And the idea here was that they didn't want a place to rally against Putin. But Alexei Navalny's body was given to the mother by the Russian authorities. Okay, so this leads us to Sunday, 25 February 2024. And again, it's been an incredibly busy week up through this point with the number of jets, 7 jets, and then the AWAC on top of that, and what was going on with the aftermath of Avdiivka. Zelenskyy, this was a bombshell. Zelenskyy says 31,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed since the start of the full-scale invasion. I'm not sure how to understand that math because that seems entirely too low. The U.S. estimates as of, I think, last August, were 70,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed, but they could know something that I don't know. I would like to understand why that's so low, and I don't wish that it was any higher. I just want to understand. The story that you might have missed was that half of Western arms to Ukraine were delivered late, according to Kyiv, and this is the real problem. This is why they had to leave Avdiivka, because they just didn't have the ammunition to be able to pursue the fight. Okay, that's it for the weekly update. I hope that helps you and informs you and helps you understand the context in the war in Ukraine. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, and the coffees, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.